items 2, 3, and 4. Now, this is item 2 in particularly was that this council review the past 20 years of the city's police department reform recommendations and the resulted changes. And then we also have item 3, which is submitting questions, concerns, comments, and ideas regarding police staffing in response to Chief Femino's memo of January 31st, 2021 for the February 1st Public Health and Safety Committee. So, and then finally, the catch-all item of 209789 that this Council's Committee on Finance discussed people's budget priorities. So with that said, this evening we are joined tonight by a member of the public who has provided a fairly robust amount of research materials and has requested to address the City Council's Finance Committee with relation to item 211826. To that end, I am going to sponsor Sam Alterman to address the council. Are there any objections? All right, then hearing none, I'd like to go ahead and transfer presentation. Welcome, Sam Alterman. Can you join us on screen?
Hi, yes, hello. Can you hear and see me?
We can hear and see you. Thank you for joining us this evening. You should be getting the presenter role now. Are you able to share your screen materials?
Can everyone see okay?
We can see that just fine. Before we go forward, I know there was one item, the original study that had not made it into Minute Track. Oh, and I see it has now been added as item number 3 in our committee meeting handout. So thank you to the clerks for getting that in there. Just to let everyone know, we did invite the police department, the chief, to attend tonight and send representatives, but they have declined to join us this evening and say they are unavailable to make it. However, the presentation and the video will be available, obviously, online forever. Well, for some value of forever. But with that said, thank you, Sam Altman, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Chair Scott, for allowing me to present tonight. My name is Sam Alterman.
Before I launch, before I launch too much, for questions from the committee, would you like people to interject that during slides, or would you like to wait until the end to take questions?
I think it might be easier to go at the end just because there's a lot I want to get through. But if there's any urgent questions, I would be happy to answer those during the presentation.
All right, as always, members of the committee, just fire it off in chat if you'd like to interject. Thank you. My apologies.
No worries. So yeah, is it still sharing? Yes, good. Yeah, once again, thank you to Chair Scott for allowing me to present tonight. My name is Sam Alterman. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a Ward 3 resident, and I'm a member of the Defund SPD research team. And I'm here tonight to share with you some research that we've been doing on the history of attempted police reform here in Somerville. Just to give a quick overview of what I'm going to touch on tonight, I'll start with a little bit about Defund SPD and our research team, and then I'll move on to sharing what we found about the city's reform efforts from 2000 to the present. And then I'll identify some through lines from those efforts and share a bit about what they might tell us about the force today. So I'll start by sharing a little bit about Defund SPD. We're a grassroots community-powered organization powered by a core of about 100 resident organizers and a broader network of over 2,500 resident supporters. The 30 members of our research team work on projects ranging from historical research and data analysis, like what you'll see tonight, to projects looking at how other cities are changing their approach to public safety, to looking at city budget data over time. What unites all these projects is our mission statement, which is to create data-supported narratives to inform and convince a majority of Somerville residents, all city council members, and the mayor that reallocating a significant portion of the SPD budget to high priority areas will have an overwhelmingly positive effect on the health, safety, and well-being of all Somerville residents. And that brings us to our subject for tonight, which is a history of 20 years of attempted police reform in Somerville. But before we dive in, I'm going to be very clear about something. What I'm not here to do tonight is to present Defund's plan for public safety staffing. Instead, my goal tonight is to share with this council the city's own previous analyses of public safety staffing in the hopes that this can inform you as you make budgetary decisions over the next month. We're going to start the period that our group looked at started with the 2001 management study of the Somerville Police Department. The study was carried out by MMA Consulting Group over the last several months of 2000 and then was released in January of 2001. The consultants were given a large degree of access to the inner workings of the police department so that they could examine how the department operated and identify steps that they felt needed to be taken to ensure that it was providing the level of service they felt the public deserved. The management study, as you may have seen from the attached materials, has well over 100 pages of in-depth analysis and made a total of 82 recommendations, ranging from how the department is structured to how meetings should be run to the creation of a civilian oversight body to provide input on police policy. We obviously can't get into all of this tonight, but there's three in particular I want to highlight that I believe are of particular interest to the council. First, the consultants encouraged the department to reevaluate their staffing levels and reassign many roles filled by sworn officers to trained unarmed civilians. Second, the consultants called on the department to make more effective use of their resources and highlighted several roles they thought should be eliminated to allow more officers to respond to calls for service without increasing the size of the force. And finally, they encouraged the department to explore alternative scheduling arrangements to make the staffing more efficient. While these recommendations are now more than 20 years old, the topics that were discussed by this management study have been many of the same topics discussed by this council over the past year. For example, Councillor Niedergang has repeatedly encouraged the department to pursue alternative scheduling arrangements. We can also see that in many cases, very specific issues the management study called on the police department to address have not changed. For example, the management study highlighted several instances of sworn officers performing clerical duties in the Traffic Division, the Criminal Investigations Division, and the Records Unit. The positions in the Records Unit were civilianized in 2006. However, the FY21 org chart presented by the chief last summer still lists clerical positions in the Traffic and Criminal Investigations Divisions that are filled by sworn officers. We can also see that in some cases, specific positions that the study recommended for elimination still exist today. For example, the position of station or inside officer, which the study said had unclear purpose and questionable utility, continues to be assigned to 3 officers on every shift. We can also see that assignments in City Hall, which the management study said, quote, do not require the assignment of a person who has the powers of arrest, are still in use and indeed were highlighted by this council last year. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic preventing us from accessing physical newspaper records at the library, we can't say much about how the 2001 management study was received. However, we do know that the police department and the 2001 management study remained topics of concern when Joe Curtatone took office. The Somerville Times reported that police issues had been a topic of discussion in the 2003 mayoral election, and about 3 months after taking office, Mayor Curtatone hired the former Attorney General of Massachusetts, Scott Harshbarger, to examine what progress was made on the 2001 management study, a move which was supported by the Patrolmen's Union. What Harshbarger found was that not much had changed since 2001. He argued that the department had not adequately responded to the study, and despite some slight changes here and there, little real progress had been made. Despite the prevailing political consensus in the city that the department needed more officers, Harshbarger argued the real issue was that the department didn't make effective use of the resources it had. Many in the city greeted this analysis as an important call to action, with Alderman at Large William A. White Jr. telling the Somerville Times, I think the recommendations made in the review represent a very practical way to get to the heart of the matter. Some in the city, however, disagreed. George McLean, the then chief of police, wrote a counter memo disputing Scott Harshbarger's findings several weeks later on November 23, 2004. McLean's memo, which the city heavily redacted in their public records request, but we were able to find unredacted online, disagreed with Scott Harshbarger's assessment that the department didn't utilize its resources effectively and argued that the department had in fact been stretched thin. Speaking to the Boston Globe, Harshbarger indicated that he was saddened by this response, which he remarked was almost identical to what he had heard when he raised the same issue 6 months prior. To address the issues that Harshbarger had highlighted, his memo recommended that Mayor Curtatone appoint a small, independent expert and community public safety advisory group, which the mayor then did 6 months later. The police advisory group was chaired by Scott Harshbarger and charged with overseeing the reform and reorganization of the department, with a particular eye towards the issues raised in his 2004 memo. The members of the advisory group were appointed by the mayor and supported by staff from both the police department and the administration. And after 5 months of investigation, they reported their initial findings in September of 2005. Before we get into the report, we would like to note the composition of the group. Over half the 7 members had existing ties to law enforcement, and 2 of them were actively serving as police officers. Thus, we feel it's fair to say that the advisory group was not habitually adversarial towards the institution of policing. The report they produced made many of the same recommendations that were made in 2001 and continue to be considered by this council. For example, they once again called for civilianizing positions that did not require police training and making more efficient use of their staffing by redeploying officers with administrative or in-station duties. And despite Chief McQueen's contention a year before that the fundamental issue the police department faced was the lack of staff, the advisory group once again recommended that the city not increase police staffing. In response, the Patrolmen's Union took out 2 full-page newspaper ads attacking the mayor, alleging that he had decimated or eliminated the Detectives Bureau, the Domestic Violence Unit, and the Juvenile Unit, all charges which the mayor denied. In spite of the pushback, the police advisory group continued to advocate for changes to the Somerville PD. Unfortunately, at this point, the historical record becomes difficult for us to ascertain. The 2005 report recommended that the mayor reconvene the advisory group at the end of fiscal year 2006, so that they could review progress in the recommendations and provide the mayor with an update by August of 2006. When we initially requested the 2005 report from the city, we also requested all subsequent reports issued by the Somerville Police Department Advisory Group, and were told after a thorough search, the city could find no documents responsive to our request. In response to a subsequent request that included any documents related to the reconvening of or decision not to reconvene the Somerville Police Advisory Group at the end of FY06, we were again told the city could not find any responsive documents. However, in the course of our research, we discovered a press release archived on the Old City website, confirming that the Police Advisory Group did indeed meet again in 2006 and issued a second set of recommendations. The press release also notes that the report had a cover memo, indicating the advisory group would meet again in 6 months, so it's possible that there's also a 2007 report that the city has been unable to locate. And then in 2008, Mayor Curtatone made it known that he felt the issues of police reform had been settled. Writing in the Somerville Times after the Board of Aldermen voted to remove 2 deputy chief positions from civil service, the mayor said the change, quote, has to be seen as the finishing touch on a long series of interlocking changes, and stated that after 3 years, all of the police advisory group's changes had been achieved. Mayor Curtatone reiterated this position last summer, responding to a question from Councillor Mba about the police advisory group by saying, and I quote, progress had been made and the advisory group was phased out. The police department had achieved all of its recommendations. However, as we've seen, while the police chief's position was removed from civil service and some positions were civilianized, many of the positions highlighted by the 2001 management study continued to be filled by sworn officers. In the same op-ed, Mayor Curtatone celebrated the addition of 12 net new officers to the force, in spite of the advisory group's explicit recommendation not to increase staffing. And while civilianization and force reduction were no longer being actively pursued by the city, the desire for these changes continued to be voiced by the community, which we see in the response to events surrounding the so-called Straight Pride Parade in 2019. To refresh everyone's memories, on August 31st of 2019, white nationalists held a so-called, quote, Straight Pride Parade, in actuality an anti-LGBTQ rally, through downtown Boston. The Somerville PD provided support to Boston PD for the event, and on-the-ground reports and videos led to widespread public outcry over the use of force by police officers, including officers from Somerville PD, against those protesting the parade. In response to the outcry expressed in public hearings, petitions from residents, and an official complaint to the police department, the SPD conducted a self-review of its actions, which ultimately found no fault. However, Mayor Curtatone and Chief of Police David Fallon also made a commitment to ensure that all in our community feel safe and protected by continuing and ongoing dialogue. The city initiated that dialogue with a community feedback meeting on January 22nd of last year. Our research found that many of the recommendations made by the residents at this meeting were the same ones that had been repeatedly made in the 2001 management study, Scott Harshbarger's 2004 memo, and the 2005 Police Advisory Group report, replacing the police with civilians, reducing the police department's funding, and putting the department under civilian oversight and control. We also noted that some participants expressed their concerns that the city was slow walking its reforms in response to Straight Pride to prevent anything from gaining momentum. And our research found that this concern seemed to have been borne out by the city's handling of this community feedback meeting. The draft report we gathered this information from does not seem to have ever been released in a final form, and the city has had no further follow-up related to Straight Pride. However, policing would remain a topic of discussion in the city throughout 2020 and continuing to the present day. After the murder of George Floyd 1 year ago, a subsequent national uprising around police violence, over 4,000 Somerville residents signed the Defund SPD petition, calling for the disarming of the police department and shrinking its $17 million budget. The petition stated, "We demand that our city allocate much less money to policing and much more to nonviolent public services," demands which were reiterated by many residents during a public hearing. And as a result, for the first time we could identify in the 20-year period we studied, police reform in Somerville was associated with cuts to the police budget being used to fund other city services, with this council reducing police budget by 7.7% or more than $700,000, and the administration following the council's request to redistribute that money to nonviolent public services. There were also several commitments made by the administration, such as the hiring of a racial and social justice director, the formation of a civilian oversight committee, and the compilation of a report on reimagining policing under a new public safety model in time for the FY22 budget process. However, the city's implementation has once again raised concerns about slow-walking reforms. The original timeline presented by the mayor targeted hiring a racial and social justice director by September of 2020. That job posting did not go up until November of 2020, and Denise Molina-Capers wasn't hired until March of 2021. The community process on reimagining policing, slated to begin in October of 2020, has still not begun, making it impossible for a final report to be released this month in time for reallocation of funding to implement the new public safety model being a part of the FY22 budget as originally proposed. If the public seems impatient for these changes, it may be because the city is not living up to the expectations it has set. In January 2021, we also saw the release of a report on community safety in the city by the Summerville Trotter Collaborative team at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. The Trotter report also recommended further reallocation of police funding to other services and civilianization of many roles. In response to these calls for defunding the police department has claimed that they are currently understaffed and have been forced into excessive overtime spending. However, our analysis of overtime spending indicates that FY21 overtime actuals are actually on track to be the lowest in 10 years. So what can we learn from all this? So the first thing our research found was that repeated analyses of the police department by multiple groups, many of which were not adversarial to policing, have found that civilianization reduces costs by requiring less generalized training, it improves service by providing more specialized training, and it protects residents from an unnecessary armed response, and recommended that these changes be made in the city. We also found that repeated analyses of the police department by multiple groups have found that increasing police staffing is not necessary, and in several cases have advocated for dramatic reductions in staffing. What we have on this chart is the number of officers assigned to patrol duties per 1,000 calls for service over time. The 2001 management study had over 10 pages of analysis and data-driven conclusions for proper staffing of the police department, which they argued should be based on calls for service. From that analysis, they calculated the number of police officers needed to respond to a number of calls for service, which is indicated on this chart by the red bar and the dashed red line. And I just want to note, to be clear, that while this management study is over 20 years old, the methodology is still sound and was used again by MMA Consulting when they conducted a study on staffing levels in the Provincetown Police Department in 2013. Our analysis found that while calls for service have fallen from about 44,000 a year in 2000 to about 28,000 a year now, a reduction of about 45%, the number of officers assigned to patrol duties has decreased by only about 12% from 2000 to 2020. Thus, the number of officers on patrol duty per 1,000 calls for service has climbed from 1.31 in 2000 to 1.96 in 2020, compared to the 2001 management study's recommended staffing levels of 1.04 officers per 1,000 calls for service. Patrol thus appears to be better staffed today than it was in 2000, when the management study recommended reducing the number of officers assigned to patrol. If units like family services or general investigations are currently understaffed, that appears to be a policy decision by the police department. Our research also found that until last year, reform initiatives have not significantly included reallocation of funding, and instead we've had a consistent 15-year increase in police funds. Thus, when this council cut the SPD budget by 7.7% last summer, that only brought us back to FY18 budget levels. An additional cut of 10% in FY22 would not be unprecedented, and indeed would only return SPD to the same funding levels as in 2006 to 2008, even adjusting for inflation. And this stands in stark contrast to the proposed reorganization from the 2001 management study. If their plan had been implemented, they wrote, the actual police budget would have been decreased, and the result would have been higher productivity and efficiency with no decrease in service. All in all, our research uncovered a record on the reforms proposed in 2001 that can be described as mixed at best. While some recommendations, such as removing the police chief from civil service, have been implemented, others, such as civilianization, civilian oversight, and force reduction, have had only partial progress or no progress at all, despite being repeatedly suggested by both outside consultants and Somerville residents over the past 20 years. And so, in conclusion, I would like once again to emphasize, multiple groups that have examined the Somerville PD staffing have concluded that they do not need the number of sworn officers that they have today. These are not my personal recommendations. These are not the recommendations of Defund SPD. These are the city's own recommendations. And these recommendations have been consistently made by both the city and the public over the past 20 years without much meaningful progress. And before we get into questions, I just want to remind everyone of the stakes, which are that when we choose not to civilianize, and that when we choose not to reduce SPD sworn personnel, what that does is it prevents funds from going to other services that can directly support residents. With that, I'm very happy to take any questions that the council might have. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much, Sam. I very much appreciate that. I'm going to open up the floor to questions from my colleagues shortly. Before I do so, I do want to thank State Rep Erica Idahoven, who I see is in the audience, as well as 3 of our colleagues on the City Council who do not serve on the Finance Committee who are watching this evening, Councilor Ewan Campen, Councilor Klingon, and Councilor Niedergang. Thank you for joining us this evening. As well, I do want to put out my personal thanks to members of the Somerville Police Department who are in attendance watching as members of the public. I see at least 1 sergeant and 3 patrol officers whose names I recognize just off the top of my head. So thank you for your attendance as well. And the other looks like nearly 3 dozen members of the public who are watching this evening. So thank you very much for that well-researched presentation. I do have some questions myself, but I see Councilor Mba has something to say first. Councilor Mba, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Scott. Thank you, Sam Altman. This is it's such a thoughtful presentation, like in just the time and energy that you and other members of the community have put into it. It's something that I want to thank you for on behalf of your entire organization, because I mean you are the profile of the city, whether people like it or not, and I believe that we need to think about how we can reinvest from the police budget into our schools to break the school to prison pipeline, so it's all, the same. And I was like really surprised, like how last year I tried to chop off some fat from the police overtime and all the Councilor Scott supported me, so it's like, and I hope this year again, when I look, zooming into that overtime, I will get maybe some 2 extra or 3 more supporters, because that is, I will always find ways to like, and also like reinvest those, like resources where I can. And I want to say, I've looked at just the information. I know I asked a question about like the police advisory. I'm surprised that you remember that. That's like, you guys are, really like thoughtful and really being very invested, because you're invested in the city. Everybody wants to feel safe, and then we need to rebuild trust in the community, especially with our police department. And so I just want to say, I appreciate that thoughtfulness. There's quite a lot of you, like maybe 4,000 or something. I don't know, but I saw 2,600. I will scale it up to 4,000 or even 10,000. Knowing that we have 80,000 people that live in this city that we are responsible for. So, that said, I just want to, like give you my profound gratitude that we'll be looking carefully into all these different dynamics, asking thoughtful questions, and hopefully you'll be watching to see like how things will be unfolding. And I want to say, there's no doubt, everybody realizes that we need some alternative to policing. Policing should not be responding to everything. And it would be nice down the road, like to actually, I would like to see like how to test a plan. Like, I don't know, like I'm trying to like see how I can frame this question, because I don't want to fly blind. Do I make sense? Like, I want to be able to, like, yes, like, everything it makes so much sense. Like, how do we move from this, like from here to like the next level where we can even start creating this alternative rapid response unit? We've been pontificating this for like a year now, but I haven't seen any of that stuff. So I don't know if somebody, because most of the research that you presented it's clear that there's a lot of work that we need to do. So how do we like start to like really create that system, build that alternative unit? And I have to say that we cannot build that in isolation or in a vacuum. And somebody would think that like if we need to build that system, the police must also be at the table to create that system, because even they themselves have spoken to a few of the officers. They're like, well, which I know I shouldn't be responding to XYZ. I'm like, okay, so like what is the next, like how do we phase out this, like, so they also probably feel exhausted, but at the same time, let's create, let's set up like some pilot or whatever. Like, nothing has been done. We are talking about this thing, and I want to see a real change. I will try to chop off the border, but I want to see something that I can hold on to, so that I can say, okay, like this is this is the new model. And so we are like, now, like I said, I want to take like some of the overtime money, put it in the schools, like hire more counselors, guidance counselors, more things that that will improve people's lives. But that is clear, tangible thing that I can see happening. But in terms of the other structures, like, who is doing that work to start to like to say, okay, like maybe there's like some consultant that has done this, maybe in I know, like there's all these different places that some of these different reforms have been implemented, just so we can bring somebody, and hire someone that can help us start to like reshape the conversation. But it's hard for me to, especially for me that is directly related to this issue, like this is like something that is so personal to me. So that's why I'm like, seeing you, I was the only person on the city council that signed to defund the police petition. So that is like, you have a core mission, and the conversation, it makes sense. I know people, like they hear the word, they panic, because they just feel like, oh, like we just want to like, I know, like, conceptually, to me, when I hear that word, I hear about, like reallocating, changing the structure of policing and reinvesting in community. But of course, it's like, so people, when they just hear that, they just feel like, oh, well, maybe in your head, you're like, you don't want to see zero policing, which of course, I would love that goal, like in that future space. But how do we start? Like, this is our smart research, smart, like, and sometimes we don't even need, it's even common sense that everything you presented makes so much sense. So there's a lot that shows that there's a lot of work that we need to do. And how do we get from here to there? What is the next? That activation energy is already there. So bring the next person that can now start creating some of this unit, so that when I hear that there's something happening, maybe in a certain ward, or somebody went there and responded, we need a guidance counselor that attended to an opioid abuse instead of like a police officer, and this is like on a volunteer time or something, we will even probably create money to do that, so that we can see something start to happen. Because we cannot phase out and then now start, before we start imagining that, okay, like, how do we do, like, where do we start to now, like, kind of like optimizing like the next, I don't know if I'm making sense, but all is like, I'm so grateful, like, just for the time and energy that everything, and I promise that, I will chop off some of that, fat that this department has, to the extent possible, so that we can, like, reinvest, in a community. And I want to do that not in a vacuum also. Like, you want to make sure that, like this, they're also part of the conversation, so they see that, hey, this is what the community wants. They're accountable to the community. And I feel like the few people that I've spoken to, I was in one meeting where I think Benjamin campaign was there, and I think housing and community development. There was Captain Jim O'Donovan. He was part of the conversation, and I was really grateful that every time we are having this conversation, we need them at the table. Like, we shouldn't fly blind. Like, we're not gonna go far, and I don't want to play that game. I don't want to use any of this, pontification because I need some kind of form of support. No, I want to see real change. This is something that you've put so much time and energy, and like I said, you're the profile of this city. Whether people like it or not, they need to understand that, we, like as a community, we want to redefine policing. And I'm sure a fraction of the police department know that, and they probably want to be part of that restructuring. Look at even the recent new hires. They're all young people like you and I. So it's like, if they are not part of the conversation, I don't know like where we are going. But enough said. But I love you guys, and I fully support the thought, the emotion, and because I relate with this, and I really want to see real change happen and not just talk. Enough talking and no action. So I'm all on board. In terms of I might say I'm all on board for reforming. You can take in your head that defunding, but that's fine too. But I'm all like, the love is there. We want to change the conversation. We want to change the structure, and we want to do it together because we still need to rebuild trust. That is where I'm coming from. There's so much work to be done, and I'm not using this like some form of grandstand because I'm running for higher office. No, but I am committed to rebuilding this community, and changing the conversation about how policing should be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that feedback, Councillor Mba. I very much appreciate it. So I didn't do as much research on alternative models to policing just because that was a bit outside of the scope of my project. However, there are several other people on our research team who have been looking into other models for public safety and what other cities are doing, and I'm sure they would be quite happy to work with you about that. I think that this is, one thing we did find in our research is that, going back through Straight Pride Parade and before that, there was a lot of interest in the community toward looking at different ways to deal with public safety issues. And there just has not been much engagement from the administration when it comes to actually removing funding from the police department and putting it into other agencies.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you. Thank you for all the work you've done and all the time. This is all volunteer time. We are here, we are being paid. So it's you can see that differential. It's like you have to like really, take on something like this. This is something that we need to even have a stipend for people that want to volunteer to make this community better. They should be able to, there should be some funds, even if we cannot produce it legally, we can fundraise to help community groups like you that, like put in time and energy to make this community better. Enough said. Thank you, Chairman Scott.
All right, thank you, Councillor Mba. Very much appreciated. Also, the floor is also open for other colleagues who have comments or questions. I don't see any at the moment, so I guess I would just, I really appreciate the staffing levels and the retrospective that you presented on recommendations that, as you pointed out, in some cases came from police-dominated advisory groups, some from paid consultants that do this work for other communities across the Commonwealth as well. One question that I had was about the 1.03 officers per call for service. What does that actually translate into in terms of number of patrol positions? I don't know if you have a graph about calls for service year over year or any of that, but what does that actually translate into in terms of numbers if we were to match the recommendation that was made in 2001 to the levels of calls of service that we have right now?
Thank you very much for that question, Chair Scott. So we had hoped to have more data to present on calls for service to this council. Unfortunately, the city was very, very slow to respond to our records request for that. And actually, to Councilor Mbah's point about funding, they ended up charging us money to get that data, and we got it very, very late Friday night. And we wanted to make sure that we got this presentation to the council in time for all of you to have the weekend to really read it, because I know it's a whole lot of information. I've been stewing in it for several months. But so the number that they got, it's 1.03 per 1,000 calls for service. And what they did was they looked through the police department's own records of how long it took to respond to calls for service. This is all on pages, this is all on pages 16 to 20 of that management study that is in the documents we sent over. What they did was they then calculated how long the average call for service takes to respond to. They then calculated how many hours each sworn officer works, and then they, from that, calculated how many sworn officers on patrol duty. So to be clear, this is not including traffic, this is not including neighborhood policing, this is not including any detectives or anyone in the investigations division. This is entirely within patrol officers assigned to patrol. They from that calculated how many of those you would need to respond to a given number of calls for service. And so what we found was that you would only need about, I believe the number is 28 officers to respond to the current number of calls for service we have. And that would amount to, if we reduce those levels, that would amount to about a 10% reduction in the police department based on my sort of back of the envelope calculations.
A 10% reduction in the current patrol officer roster?
No, I'm sorry. That would be a 45% reduction in the current patrol officer roster, leading to a 10% decrease in the police budget.
All right. The other question I had, there was a very interesting slide about overtime, because we have heard over and over that the health and safety of our employees is at risk because there are forced holdovers. Officers are being forced to work 24 hours in a row. The staffing levels are critically dangerous. I guess I'm surprised to see overtime spending is so reduced. So can you maybe help me with where these numbers, thank you for bringing up the slide, where did these numbers come from?
These came from the actual FY, these came from the FY actuals. So what we did is we went into every budget presentation from the past 10 years and looked at the actual overtime spending. And then we inflation adjusted it. And then we also looked at this year's end of April actuals and then presented them out to the full fiscal year. And we were a little surprised by this too, but I will say one thing we found in our research is that the police do seem to consistently claim they are understaffed and need more staffing, regardless of what other people who have looked at their staffing seem to think about that issue.
Okay. This is very interesting information in terms of so this is the actuals that were reported out by the city at the end of each fiscal year, and then this year's first 10
end of
months
April actuals
projected out. Okay. I guess one other question I had, you mentioned public records requests and that you were charged money for these public records requests that in some cases were unresponsive. Did I hear correctly that sometimes the city would redact documents that were already publicly available on the internet unredacted? Did I hear that right?
Yes, you did. Here, I can show you. So I can show you what I initially got when I requested Scott Harshbarger's 2004 memo. So initially, the city redacted the entire memorandum. They very courteously left in Dear Mayor Curtatone, so I will give them that. But they redacted all the content, claiming that it was protected by both attorney-client privilege and exemption C and D of the Massachusetts Public Records Law. I had started to piece stuff together because my understanding based on this research was that it was a public document at the time. It was reported in the Boston Globe. It was quoted in the Somerville Times. In a later Boston Globe piece, Scott Harshbarger discussed the contents with the Boston Globe reporter, which was to me not consistent with how a former Attorney General of Massachusetts would talk about a document protected by attorney-client privilege. So I sent an email to the city solicitor's office challenging that rationale and started piecing stuff together. After that challenge, they sent me back another memo that was less redacted, that still had very significant redactions, but we were able to look at quotes that were reported in other sources and figure out some of what was missing. Then, so late last week, I had submitted a request over a month ago for Chief McLean's counter memo, which they sent back to me. They said they could only find one copy, and it was heavily redacted. However, it seemed to be a printout from a former member of the Board of Aldermen's campaign website, which we discovered was still preserved on the Internet Archive, which once again leads credence to the fact that this and the Harshbridge report, which was reported on the same website, were publicly available documents at the time. And so we were able to provide this council and the public with unredacted versions of these documents through the Internet Archive. And I just also want to note that you might have noticed that in the that at the end of Chief McLean's counter memo, it talks about a 15-page appendix that responds to each recommendation from the 2001 management study. I emailed the city solicitor's office about that, asking if they had been asking if that was clerical error or a separate document I needed to request, and I was told that the city had only found one copy, which was this printout from a campaign website, and the attachment was not there, so it appears that it's been lost by the city.
Okay, and the one thing that stuck out is there was some document that you had requested that the city said was unavailable, that they didn't have any copy of it, but then you found it on the city's web servers?
Yes, so that is with the 2006 advisory report. We did not find the actual report. So in our initial document request, which was submitted by Miles, we asked, in addition to asking for the 2005 Police Advisory Group report, we asked for any further reports that might have been created by this body. And what we heard from the city records office was that they had conducted a thorough search and could not find any documents responsive. When I then went back to request the 2001 management study, I also requested any information related to the reconvening of or decision not to reconvene the Police Advisory Group, because we all felt that it was extremely unusual that a body that had recommended it reconvene in a year would simply not do that without any documentation of that, but we're once again told that the city could not find any documents related to that. However, we were poking around on the old city website, and I will divulge a bit of our methodology there. I went to archive.somervillema.gov and searched Harshbarger, and the first result we found was a press release from 2006, which talks about there being a second advisory group report, which made new recommendations, and also notes that a memo included with that report suggested meeting again in 6 months. So it's possible that there's a 2007 report that the city has been unable to locate.
That certainly sounds like a responsive document.
My understanding of the Massachusetts public record law is that the website would itself be a responsive document.
Right, okay. Troubling, but no, I thank you for this research. I think this gives us, at least for myself, a different lens when hearing that we need more study, that we don't know the answers, that we really haven't looked at this before. I'm surprised at the depth, especially in the 2001 management study, which the city apparently paid good taxpayers dollars for back 20 years ago. Do any of my other colleagues have questions? This is an incredible amount of research that's been gathered. And we have Sam Alderman here. Okay, I see Councilor Ballantyne, you have a question. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Sam, Derek, and Miles, who also worked on this because their names were on the cover. I can always say we can brag about the people who live in Somerville because they're engaged and they do the work. So I really, I appreciate the engagement on this. This was a lot to digest, so I will mention that I was the thing that I am, you know, trying to figure out, and it's calls for service, I guess is the term, is that I'm trying to understand, I'm going to use lay terms. The way I would say it is the need or the demand, and those different types of service calls, I guess you would say, that are done. And do domestic violence calls require more time than other calls, and how that factors in to staffing? I did ask those questions last year, and I don't have the answers. So that's one. And the second question that I was really curious about is the population, I think, of the city of Somerville 20 years ago was about 75,000, 74,000, and we're about 82,000 now, 81,000. And I wonder what's happened over time in terms of the service call. So why the reduction? What is the difference between the types of service calls that were done 20 years ago to the service calls that were here? Does population play a factor in any of this? And yeah, those were, you know, big, more high level questions I was trying to understand. And the types, the need, the demand. I think of building a budget, having done that for organizations, is you try to understand what your need is, the demand, the types of it, what differentiates it, then build a staffing budget from there, and then, you know, determine obviously what your budget is.
Thank you very much for those questions, Councillor Ballantyne. To your first question about different types of staffing and or different types of calls and how much they take, that is not included in their analysis. What they did do is they actually went through the actual logs of like police dispatch and calculated how long it takes to respond to calls for service. And they built in the fact that, for example, in their analysis, they built in that about 50% of the calls were handled by 2 officers, 25% were handled by 3 officers. They built in varying lengths. There's overhead room built into their analysis for all of that. I also would just like to note that it is another unfortunate through line that we discovered, that the department has not been able to get you those numbers. As you might see on page 15 of the management study, they note that the management consultants note that when they requested the calls for service data, and I quote, that information was not immediately available and actually took several days to obtain because the computer programmer needed to write a program just to retrieve the data in that format. And that is unfortunately something that we also saw in our request for calls for service, which is why I unfortunately do not have for you like a breakdown of different types of calls for service. The city took an extremely long time to respond to that. We had to argue with them about the fact that like this was actually something that could be presented in a compressed format. And they sent us, I believe it was 10 spreadsheets with about 7,000 entries, with like tens of thousands of entries each, very late Friday. And so I'm afraid that today I can't present that to you. We would love to be in touch with any members who would love to see that as we get into that analysis, and would love to come back to speak to that again. So do you remind me of your second question?
So I'm just wondering what, you know, I guess it's hard to answer because we don't know the types of service calls that were done, but I'm trying to understand again how population plays into it. So anecdotally, I have heard that shoplifting has increased in Somerville because shoplifting typically happened around Davis Square, but we now have Assembly Row and there is more retail. So I assume that the number of shoplifting, or excuse me, I've been told that there's more shoplifting going on and theft going on. And we've increase the population. So I'm just trying to see, is there anything that can be gleaned from population change, also the types of developments that we're doing, does that shift the service calls or, to a particular type? And does that particular type require more or less hours?
So to the first part of your question, I think one of the things that you see like just nationally around the United States is that crime in urban areas has decreased significantly in the past 20 years. Another thing you see if you, this is not something I've dug super deep on, but there are other members of our team who have looked into this. And it's also something that outside of this research I've just been interested in, is that there's actually a lot of social science research that indicates the perception of crime and the actual levels of crime are often completely different things. And you very frequently have cases where crime is in actuality going down, but there's a perception that it's going up. I would, we did not have the level of access to the police department's internal records that these management consultants had. As I discussed with Councillor Scott, we had to work pretty hard just to get what we presented to you tonight. If the department were to open itself up to some outside independent evaluator looking through their records and getting access to all this fine-grained data and sort of trying to replicate the analysis done in 2000 to see if calls for service might take more time, I personally would welcome that. I think that would be a good point of information for us. However, that's not something I can speak to with the level of access the police department has given to me as just a resident volunteer.
Okay. Thank you for that. I have heard, this is a little bit aside, yes, that the numbers of crime or the data, the violent crimes, I don't know if I'm using the right labels here, has decreased, and also that there's a correlation with public health and that there's a correlation with when leaded fuel was in the air more often, and that crime is correlated to having gone down significantly when we changed to unleaded gasoline. And I have had conversations with the former chief about the activity we have in the streets of Somerville. So the more active, if the planning is good, if the more active they are in the street festivals there are, and there are more people in the train, that also has a correlation to there being less crime in there. So I do believe it's gone down. I'm trying to understand, what does population play into that? It's just a curious question that I have. So thank you. I don't know if you have any comments to that, but thank you.
My comment to that would be, I think that would, I too read that Mother Jones article. I thought it was an interesting article. I don't feel like I know enough about social science to really comment before this committee about what drives crime. However, a lot of social science research has indicated that crime is often driven by societal conditions, and that the best way to decrease crime levels are actually to address the social determinants of crime. And that could perhaps figure into how the city looks at dealing with the issues we do still have.
Yeah, I know that I have asked for data. I have received it in the past for assault and domestic violence, and I understand that. I don't know what's happened in the last 18 months, but I do, the data that the police had pulled was those particular areas, they were going up. Ward 2 having the worst, and then Ward 6, and then Ward 7. So I am interested as we move into the budget times, and we have not had Resistat meetings, and that was always a number that I asked the chief for at all the Resistat meetings, is to understand what is happening in that area of crime and assault. So yeah, okay. Thank you again to you, Sam, Miles, and Derek, and everybody else on the team for going through and sharing this information.
I may just make one brief last comment on your comments, Councillor Ballantyne.
Yeah.
Looking again at actually the slide that happens to be up right now, which is patrol staffing for calls for service. So patrol doesn't include family services. It doesn't include officers responding to domestic violence calls. And thus, again, our staffing in patrol appears to be more extensive than it was in 2000 when the management consultants recommended decreasing the number of officers assigned for patrol. And thus, if there are not enough officers right now to deal with domestic violence calls, that would appear to be a policy decision made by the police department rather than a function of actual spending.
Thank you for sharing that. It's an interesting comment. I don't know, when a call comes in, I don't know what that's typically like. Is it identified immediately? So I can imagine that some patrol officers are responding to incidences that they might not know. I don't know if it's, that clear and black and white, but thank you for the, adding your comments there. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Councilor Valentine. I appreciate that. Again, the floor is still open for any other members of the committee. One question that came up for me, so we can see the calls for service here. I know there's been discussions about the amount of crime in Somerville going down. And, again, that your point about the perception of crime versus the actuals is absolutely something that, we're all susceptible to our own anecdotes and experiences. Was there any data available that you had that went into what the actual levels of crime in the city have been like over this 20-year period, and how that was measured? Or is that for another presentation, another time?
We did not look into that. That could be another presentation. However, I want to note that if you look at pages 14 to 15 of the 2001 management study, the authors actually explicitly reject crime numbers as the way to develop staffing levels, because each community is unique and has its own problems requiring different kinds of police response. And thus, they really focus in on calls for service, which is how much are people asking for there to be police. And what we can say is that those have very consistently dropped over the past 20 years, and have, comparing 2000 to 2020, we see a decrease of about 45%.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a good way to put it. How often do people want the police to show up? And that's down 45% over the last 20 years. Okay. All right. Councilor Mba on that point.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Scott. So Sam, just to piggyback, I've been going back and forth with these little ones here. But if you look at like the performance measures achieved by the police department, like from 2014 to 2019, you will see like that steady decrease in crime. But so I guess is it due to like, does it correspond with economic data, like more people had jobs and better wages? And so there were fewer instances of domestic violence and gun violence, or like, is it, I know I have a bunch of questions, but I reserve it like to the chief or whoever will be speaking for the police. I don't, so, but did you find out like that some of this decrease in crime correlates with that, with economic data and other stuff?
We're getting a little bit outside of my expertise from this research. That wasn't something we looked at in this. We wanted to really look at specifically what the city had previously done on police issues and on police staffing. And thus, because these city analyses did not draw very heavily on crime rates as the driver of these things, they really were focused on calls for service. We did not get very much into that. I know some of that is discussed in the Trotter Collaborative's report, which I know this council has previously discussed. And there are other members of our team who have been looking into issues related to that, and I'm sure they would be quite happy to present to this council as well.
Okay, no worries. Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman
No
Scott.
problem. I'm just cautious of speaking out of naivete.
No, you're great.
All right. I appreciate it. It sounds like we have several more appointments ahead of us, and I frankly am grateful for the resident energy on this. So I see Councilor Ballantyne has a question. Councilor Ballantyne?
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up because I'm not exactly sure how this is handled. But I think it was around 2011 or 12 that CORE started. So the community, or 2013, Community Outreach and Health Recovery, that's led by Patty Contente, the social worker at the police department. So the calls for service, so I guess do the calls for service include anything that department works on? Because, I know it was started because of a tragic death in 2007 or 10. So I'm trying to understand, I believe, they started the jail diversion program was started within the police department. And were those numbers previously part of calls for service taken out, or were they never, did they never overlap?
So to your broader point about CORE, there is a team within our research team that has been looking at CORE and comparing to ways that they feel that it falls significantly short of what other alternative response programs like Cahoots do. And I'm sure they would also relish the opportunity to share their wonderful research with this council. I feel like I'm the pitch person for the Defund SPD research team tonight. So if there was no alternative responding source, they probably would have been handled by police. If they're not directed to police now, presumably the numbers we got were taken from a presentation given by Chief Fallon last year as part of the budget process. So I don't have access to the fine-grained ways that they calculated those. That would be a very good question for the police department that we just did not have time to get together in time for this presentation. But if they're no longer part of it and that reduces calls for service, that would mean that there are no longer police officers responding to those calls as well. So I don't think they would skew the data in any particular way.
Okay, thank you. It would, for Ms. Racaniello, it would be good to understand just exactly what are in those numbers for call for service when they were back in 2001 versus now. I don't understand that, and I'd just like to have a clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll second that request for information there, Councilor Ballantyne. And then Councilor Rossetti, I see you have a comment. Please, you have the floor. We can't hear you, Councilor Rossetti.
You appear to be muted.
Here I am. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to our constituent Alderman. Thank you for the presentation and the time that you and others put in to present this evening. I have to say from the get-go, and I'm sure I'm not going to be the first person to say this, but I think there's a lot of angst in the community when they hear defund the police, the word defund, which in some definition could mean to just abolish. And there are a lot of constituents who I converse with who want to know, well, what would we do if we didn't have a police department? So I wish there could be another terminology so that more people could work together on addressing this situation that we have been discussing for a couple of years now. I don't know, fluctuate the funding. I don't know. I wish somebody could come up with another term other than defund, because I think the term defund puts a lot of people's backs up straight and anger in people that don't understand that there are groups of pods of people that want to work together and readdress what should the police department be handling and what other areas of different communities could monies be put into to take away from what the police department's responsibilities are and to take it on in other ways instead. And that's a broader picture which we are trying to get to. Sometimes it's suggested that COVID is the reason it was stalled a little bit. I'm going to look at this very seriously. To you, Mr. Chair, I'm hoping that we're going to be asking for a response from the department as it relates to this presentation this evening. I'd be very interested in hearing their response on that. And I also want to remind others in the community that last year when this body decreased the police department's budget by the largest sum of money since I've been serving, and I think it's been the largest for a long time. Quite honestly, I think we were lucky that the mayor listened to the full council and redistributed those funds and created special lines in the budget where those monies could instead perhaps be used. And that's still work in progress, but I just wanted to be clear to yourself and to others in the community that if this budget season we continue to reduce more funding from the department, there's no guarantee that the mayor is going to again come back to us to say, okay, well then let's put the money here instead to work towards, you know, housing or to work towards adolescent issues or to work towards mental health programs. We don't have that guarantee because by law, as a city council, we don't have the power to take from one line and to put into another. That's not in our power of authority. So it worked well last year that the mayor worked with us and we did that. And we do still need to continue to address it. So that's why I'm very interested in hearing what the current chief and administrative team in our city think of this presentation, because there's two sides to every story. And although this data that you presented this evening seems to be very clear cut, I would like to hear from the other side as well. And I look forward to that. And I honestly wish that budget was 6 months from now and not 6 days from now. That's going to be an issue too. But keep it coming because information like this is powerful to keep us on our toes. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, Councilor Rossetti. And I'm quite happy to add my name to the chorus calling for hashtag charter reform. To your comments about defund, I just want to be very clear that this is not defund's plan for staffing of the police department. This is the city's own previous analysis. And with regards to two sides to every story, I don't think that this represents the defund side. You know, you look at the composition of the police advisory group, if I can just pull that up, sorry. These are not, you know, this is a pretty balanced body, and they made the same recommendations. You know, I would love to hear from the chief about what they have to say about this, just out of my own personal interest, and also because I think this is an important conversation for the city to have. But again, I want to emphasize that this is not something that I and my collaborators made up. This is research that the city had already paid for and put together. And also just briefly to note, you noted that there was some concern that COVID is the reason that we've fallen behind on this timeline for reimagining policing. And I agree with you. I wish we had more time on this. I wish that the public comment period had happened. That didn't. And I just want to note that we knew about COVID when the city put forward that timeline. The timeline was put forward in June of last year. And if the city has failed to follow through on that, that is not based on COVID restrictions they didn't know about when they made those commitments. But thank you again for your comments. They're very well taken.
You're very welcome. So I just want to make sure I heard you right. So you yourself aren't looking to totally defund the department, but you want attention given to what has already been in play and not had attention given to. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think my personal views are irrelevant for this discussion. This is the material I presented tonight was created by outside bodies hired by the city of Somerville.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your response.
Thank you very much, Councilor Rossetti. I appreciate that, and I would echo that. Again, the department was sent these materials at the same time as City Council received them, and we're invited to be present. And I do know there are members of the department who are with us tonight in the audience, but we do have an entire evening scheduled for the police department in our upcoming budget review schedule. I believe I'd have to check the date, but the prospective date on that, I believe, is Monday, June 14th. At which point I'm sure the chief has all night to present that side, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion. Although I would have loved the chief or a representative of the police department here this evening. Councilor White, I see you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The quote started me going down memory lane to see what I could find in my memory banks, because I remember discussions about this and about the staffing. And one committee meeting, and I can't tell you even the year that was in, because I remember questioning, I think it was Chief Holloway, because originally the decision and the implementation involved only having 6 police vehicles in the evening being staffed, and originally it had been 7. And then I recall having a meeting and it was back to 7, and asking the chief, you had presented the plan and there was reduced staffing in the evening, and now you've gone back. And basically the response was because folks in the western part of the city were seeing a longer response period. It went back to the prior staffing. So I was wondering if there was any way to look or to determine the response times between times of the day, because in the evening it may in fact appear to be overstaffed because of the number of calls, but because of the wait time and the fact that if you have like a major call, you may have half of the police vehicles or more go to one area. So then it leaves a few other police cars for the rest of the city. So, and I don't recall actually any major review by the city council, the old board of aldermen, with regard to the response time, but it might be helpful if you folks could analyze it. And as well, I would trust now in our police department response that they may also address the issue of response times, especially again in the evenings, because I remember getting a number of complaints from folks in the entire old board of aldermen because of some of the response times, and my recollection was in West Somerville. So that might be helpful as the analysis continues. And yeah, I appreciate the work that you and your folks did. And perhaps you could check with the city clerk with some of these documents, because they may have been submitted to the city council, the reports that you mentioned, and perhaps even the appendix. So that might be like one last avenue, because the agendas are public and you're able to go back. So you could look on the agendas since the day of the first report to see if that was submitted, and any responses, in fact, if the police department responded that you might not have been able to find, but if it was sent to the old board of aldermen, for instance, that should be in the records of the city clerk. So again, recommendation of another method maybe to take a look at. And again, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for those comments, Councilor White. And I just want to commend your truly unrivaled memory of city history. You might have noticed I was looking off to the side. I was looking through this archive I put together of various news articles, and I can actually tell you that you made those comments on June 30th of 2010 for the, of 2009 for the FY 2010 budget. And I'm blown away by your ability to remember those. I will say that one of the issues the management consultants looked at was staffing based on shift. And they specifically said that they thought it was not efficient to staff the same based on, to staff every shift the same. And if there's not, and my understanding though is that there's not been action on that, and that continues to be an issue of concern for Councilor Niedergang. But I appreciate your suggestion to reach out to the city clerk. I believe any documents sent to the city clerk would be accessed through the same public records process. But if I'm mistaken about that, I'd be happy to connect more directly with the clerk to see if we can discover some of these documents that appear to be lost.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. We all have a lot to digest this evening. I appreciate this, and I also appreciate the very fine point that this is not representing the position of Defund SPD. This is simply an effort by a citizen group to catalog the various inputs and outputs of city studies over the last 20 years. So that kind of perspective is one that generally only Councillor White actually has at his fingertips, thanks to his long service in the city. But now we do as well. So we've all got a lot of reading, and I'm sure this is not the end of the conversation. But unless there's anything final you'd like to add for us, I think at this point, it's probably appropriate for us to, we could keep this item in committee for follow-up on future items, or we could simply mark it as work complete and invite future research teams to present more information based on the questions that have been asked this evening. Given that we do not have any members of the police department here tonight to respond, I'm inclined to keep this item in committee and make the invitation at another future meeting with finance to maybe get some of that information and hear some perspectives on it. So once again, thank you very much, Sam Alterman, and kudos all around.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scott, and I would like to once again thank the committee for the opportunity to share our research and for being incredibly gracious with your time and for your numerous insightful questions. I really care about getting this issue right in the city, and I hope that we can pursue a legislative process together and well informed.
All right, thank you. So these items will be kept in committee. Looks like the presenter is going back over to our agenda now.